Once a month, we have been stepping out of our sermon series to tell different moments from the grand story of God. We're telling these stories so that we can learn what happened in the Bible, so we can know the stories, but also so that we can find ourselves in the grand story of God. One of the things that it's very easy for us to forget is that the 66 books of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, they are telling many individual stories, but all of those stories are part of one grand story of God. All of Scripture, the overall plot, can be summarized as creation. God creates. The fall, people rebel against God, are separated from Him because of sin. God's mission to bring redemption. Most of the Bible is really telling those redemption stories. Then finally, at the end of the Bible, we see that restoration where God brings us fully into His kingdom, and we see God face to face, where we know as we are fully known, and where God restores all things to His original shalom. And so that's the overall story, and along the way, there's many, many, many individual stories as God works with people to propel forward that salvation mission. Over the last 2 years on these Story Sundays, we've talked about creation and the fall. We've talked about the flood. We've talked about the Tower of Babel. We've talked about the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac. We've talked about Isaac and Jacob. We've talked about a guy named Joseph and his time in Egypt. And we've talked about God's rescue of the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Last month, we talked about these stories that take place in Exodus 15 to 40, as God had rescued this group of people from slavery in Egypt. He brought them into the wilderness, and there in the wilderness at Mount Sinai, God entered a special covenant relationship with His people. The covenant goal was for God to live amongst His people, with His manifest presence represented in the tabernacle as a cloud, and all of Israel camped around the sacred tent. The rules in Exodus and Leviticus were designed to help God's people live and know that they were holy and set apart and accountable in relationship to God. Now, if you just read the book of Leviticus completely apart from everything else, if you just open your book and start pounding your way through Leviticus, some of those rules seem obscure. Sometimes it seems like there is just far too much information or involvement of religious things in the life of people, particularly when it came to skin diseases or mildews in your house. Like, it's kind of weird that you get this like mold in a corner of your house, and job number one is, hey, you need to call the priest to come and check out your house, and if that mold's the wrong kind of mold, then your house gets knocked down. Right? That seems a little bit weird that there would be so much involvement of the religious in the life of the people. But the whole vision behind all of these rules was for the Israelite people to see that all of their life was to be set apart, to be surrendered and submitted to God. And as God's people oriented their life around His plan, God's blessing would follow, not only for the people of Israel, but also for the nations around them. Now, in this Mosaic covenant, unfortunately, we rarely see the people of Israel fully keeping up their side of the agreement. Many of the Old Testament stories, and especially the ones in the wilderness wanderings, show the people's continual failure to believe and trust and obey God as He tries to lead them into new places. And for our story today, we are fast forwarding about a year after the Mount Sinai moment in the giving of the law. We're fast forwarding to the book of Numbers. And so the people of Israel have been released from slavery for about a year. They've received these laws on Mount Sinai. They understand now what it looks like to follow God. They've been camping in the wilderness in a few different places. They've celebrated Passover again, just that reminder of God's rescue. And now in Numbers 13 and 14, we find the Israelite people are camping at the southern edge of the Promised Land. The reason this land is called the Promised Land is because God had promised Abraham that He would bring his descendants into the land. God had promised Moses and the people that He would lead them into the land. This generation has watched God defeat the Egyptian army, one of the most powerful forces on earth at the time. They've heard God's voice in the fire and thunder at Mount Sinai. They've watched miracles and experienced the punishments of disbelief. And now at the edge of the land, Moses appoints some spies, 12 men, one from each tribe, to go into the land and investigate it. Before they just kind of move in willy-nilly, Moses says, hey guys, let's go in and let's make a plan. And so Moses gives the spies these instructions. Go north through the Negev into the hill country. See what the land is like and find out whether the people living there are strong or weak, few or many. See what kind of land they live in. Is it good or bad? Do their towns have walls, or are they unprotected like open camps? Is the soil fertile or poor? Are there many trees? Do your best to bring back samples of the crops you see. It happened to be the season for harvesting the first ripe grapes. And so the spies are given some pretty basic instruction. Just go check it out. We have no idea what this land is like. Our ancestors haven't lived there for 400 years, and so it probably would make sense that we go and check it out. And so the 12 men go through the land. They sneak around from south to north, east to west. They spy it all out. And along the way, they find some massive grape clusters. They find pomegranates, all kind of beautiful produce. And in all, they spend 40 days in the land. So kids, remember the number 40. That number is going to come up again. 40. That number 40 will resonate through the story. It will even ripple through the rest of the Bible. And so for 40 days, these guys are spying out the land. And after 40 days, they return. They show off the produce. They make their report. And this is what the spies said. We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it is indeed a bountiful country. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is the kind of fruit it produces. This place is awesome. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. Did you hear what they said so far? They said the promised land is a beautiful land, but there's a big problem. There's already people in it, and those people are powerful. They live in fortified cities, and there are giants among them, the descendants of Anak. Now, when you hear that the promised land, the land that God's supposed to give you, is full of other people, fortified cities and giants, I mean, the natural reaction is to start whispering. Well, did you hear that? There's giants. What? How big do you think the giants are, right? Everyone starts whispering and murmuring together. They started to murmur, but one of the other spies cut in. But Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. He says, let's go at once to take the land. He said, we can certainly conquer it. Let's do this thing. But the other men who explored the land with him disagreed. We can't go up against them. They are stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. Who wants to go fight giants in a land that's going to eat us alive? The Israelites said, 10 of the 12 said, nope, I don't want that choice. I don't want to be a giant fighter. I didn't sign up for that. Friends, a land full of giants, a land that eats the people who try to live there, people who are strong enough to squish the Israelites like bugs. Does that sound like the place that you would want to live, even if there is good food? No, not really, right? But what are we forgetting? What are the people here forgetting? Or maybe a better question would be, who are the people forgetting? They're forgetting God. Yeah. They are forgetting that God is on their side. They are forgetting the promises that he has made to them. What kind of things has God done for these people so far? Do you remember? What's he done so far in the story? Think about it. What has he done to rescue them from slavery in Egypt? What kinds of things has he done? He's parted the Red Sea. He sent all kinds of plagues against the people of Egypt. He drowned the Egyptians with the waters of the Red Sea. What other kinds of things has God done? He's fed them in the wilderness. He's given them water in the desert. Yeah. What other kinds of things has God done? He made a covenant promise, and he said, hey, on my honor, I will do these things. On my character, my name, I'll make this happen. You're not fighting alone. I am fighting with you. And one of the other things he's done is he's actually helped them beat people already. The Amalekites attacked them in Exodus 17 or 18, and God, through Moses' intercession, brought a great victory to them. And so he's already fought battles for them. But they've forgot. And even though God has demonstrated his power not only in times of victory, but even in times of punishment, even though he's shown them that he's powerful, for the 10 spies and the rest of the people, they're simply forgetting that. And so what do the people do? Well, in Numbers 14, it says they sat down and they had a good cry. Numbers 14, beginning in verse 1, says, then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died in Egypt. If only we died here in the wilderness, they complained. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? Then they plotted amongst themselves, hey, let's choose a new leader and let's go back. Do you remember the Nile River, man? We could fish there. Yeah, that fish was pretty good. And even though I was a slave, the cucumbers and the melons, they grew pretty good. You know what? I don't know if I trust this Moses guy. I don't know if I trust this God guy. Maybe it would be better just to have a comfortable life as a slave. Those are the questions that the Israelites felt like they faced. Fight giants in the land that devours you, or live a life of comfortable servitude, which means slavery. That's what the Israelites are thinking here. They're saying, you know what? We would rather be enslaved than try to fight giants in this promised land. That's the choice the Israelites wrestled with here in Numbers 13 and 14. But just as I didn't include God into that equation, so too the Israelites here are not including God in their thinking. All they see are two problems: giants or slavery. And they don't think to look to God. They don't think to include him. All they think is, you want to know what? Slavery at least is the evil that we know. I don't know about that whole giant thing. I don't know if the giants grind your bones and turn them into bread or whatever the old English giant poems are. All they knew is they're like, I think I can handle that. But Moses and Aaron and Joshua and Caleb, these men knew that God was on their side. They knew that when God was on their side, they could win every battle. And Joshua and Caleb, those are the two spies that brought back the good report. They were so distressed at the people's grumbling that they tore their clothing and said to the people of Israel, the land we traveled through and explored is a wonderful land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, he'll bring us safely into that land and give it to us. It's a rich land flowing with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. Isn't that a cool story of faith? Guess how the Israelite people responded to that? They started picking up stones and they said, you want to what? Let's kill those two guys. I don't like what they're saying. I don't like the report that they're bringing. So they started to talk about killing Caleb and Joshua. And it's at that point that God steps into the story. And God is very angry and he's very disappointed with the people. After all he had done for them, to watch them rebel and reject him, right when they were on the edge of stepping into all that he had promised, it was like a slap in the face to God. Like we've seen many times, Moses stepped in. Moses prayed that God would have mercy on the people, and God did have mercy. But he also said that none of the generation who left Egypt, none of the generation who watched him perform the miraculous deeds and rescue the people, none of those who were 20 years old or over would enter into that land. Instead, for 40 years, 1 year for every day the spies were in the land, for 40 years the people would wander through the wilderness until that entire generation died off. And then their children, the next generation, would enter the land. The only exceptions were Joshua and Caleb. Because they brought back a good report, God promised them that they would see the promised land. Out of curiosity, who here is 20 years old or younger? 20 or younger? Yeah, 20 or younger, yeah. Yeah, we have a few. So basically, they would all be fast forward 40 years. All of us who are over 20, we would all have died off in the wilderness. And now the 40 or 50-year-old Blaze and the 52-year-old Brendan, they would be that next generation, and all of their kids would be the ones who actually got to enter the land. Right? Pretty wild, except for Caleb. 85-year-old Caleb and Joshua, they got to enter the land. And it's amazing, that faith of Caleb continues. At one point in the book of Joshua, he goes to Joshua and he says, okay, Joshua, I saw this land 40 years ago. And I selected the hill that I wanted. The biggest hill with the biggest giants and the strongest walls, I picked that one. Now give me permission to go do it. I'm 85 years old, but I'm strong today as I was then. I'm ready to go tackle those giants, so just let me at them. And Caleb goes and he takes that hill of Hebron and with some of his other relatives and stuff. But a whole generation had to die off because they didn't believe. Now, this message from God broke the hearts of the people. They finally realized that they'd sinned against God. Some tried to repent by going to the land to fight, but God was not with them, and so they were defeated. And the cloud that represented God's presence moved back to the wilderness to lead the people away from the promised land. There are bright moments in the story, Caleb and Joshua, but overall, it's a pretty sad story. The people came so close to stepping into all that God had promised. But in the end, fear held them back. They forgot the God who is on their side. They forgot all that he had done for them and all the promises he had made to them. They forgot God. They rebelled against God, and for 40 years they wandered in the wilderness until that entire generation died off. But God is faithful. Like I said, he did keep his promises. Now, the book of Deuteronomy is all about Moses teaching that next generation of Israelites how to follow God. The book of Joshua tells how the next generation plus Caleb and Joshua entered the land and stepped into God's promise. But those are stories for another time. What I want to do is I just want to focus in on these events in Numbers 13 and 14. And I want to ask the question, what can we as apprentices of Jesus learn from this story? The first thing that kind of jumped out at me as I considered the story is I kind of got locked up in that 40 number. And as I was thinking about that 40 number, I remembered Jesus. Can you think of how the number 40 was significant in his life? Yeah, following his baptism and before he started his public ministry, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. And for 40 days, he prayed and fasted and was tested by Satan. Just like the Israelites in the wilderness, there was this time of testing. But unlike the Israelites who saw the size of the problem and then took their eyes off God, when Satan tempted Jesus to take shortcuts, Jesus never rebelled against God. Instead, Jesus passed the test in the wilderness. He stayed true to his mission. And Jesus was faithful all the way to the cross. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus has opened a new and life-giving way for all of us to enter into God's family. As we place our faith and trust in Jesus, as we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our hearts that God raised him from the dead, we are saved. Through faith in Jesus, we're sealed with the Spirit, and we have the promise that we will enter heaven, which the author of Hebrews calls God's rest. And that's the other thing that kind of jumped out at me as I was looking at the stories. I realized that it's the Numbers 13, 14 moment is not just in the book of Numbers, but the author of Hebrews looks back on that moment and he says, hey, friends, as he looks at the work of Jesus, as he looks at the story of Numbers, he recognizes that the promised land is something we have to step into. He turns it into a bit of an allegory, and he says, hey, relationship with Jesus is a choice one has to make. Sometimes people investigate Jesus. They think he's a good person. They like what he can do for them. But they stand at the edge of that relationship, and they don't fully commit to him. They never commit to the apprenticeship journey, or if they start investigating, they give up, and they don't persevere in following Jesus. And so the author of Hebrews urges us today, don't harden your hearts. Don't shrink back. Place your trust in Jesus, and then continue to hold fast to that trust. The lesson that we can learn from this story, one of the lessons we can learn from this story, is that Jesus has made a way for us to step into all that God has promised, to build our lives on that firm foundation. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And unlike the Israelites who stood on the edge and then rebelled and turned back, today we have a choice. We can place our faith and trust in Jesus. We can say yes to that apprenticeship journey. And so if you've never done that, then today is your chance. You can say yes to Jesus today. You can step into all that he has for you today as you place your faith and trust in him. Now, as I think about this story, there are some other lessons we can learn as well. One of the other things I think we can learn from this story as apprentices of Jesus is that we need to be a people who are continually remembering and reflecting on all that God has done for us. For the Israelite spies, they'd seen God do amazing things. They'd watched God defeat the Egyptians and the Amalekites, but somehow as these spies went through the land, they forgot God's power, and all that they could see were the giants in front of them. In many ways, this story is repeated over and over and over in Scripture. So many times, different characters in the Bible, all they can see is the natural. They see giants, they see huge walls, they see large armies, they see terrifying waves. But in every story, there are a few who keep their eyes on God. There are a few who remember that God is on their side, who see God at work. And it's these faith-filled men and women who step out in faith, and God uses them in incredible ways to accomplish his kingdom purposes. Sticking with the giant theme, just to give you an example of someone who saw a giant and didn't shrink back. About 400 years after this story in the book of Numbers, we read about a young shepherd boy, probably around 16 years old. All right? So we have a few 16-year-olds in the room, at least one. That's kind of the picture you're putting into your mind. Young boy, armed only with a sling and unwavering faith in God, he takes down a giant named Goliath. But the thing is, while he is alone in taking down the giant, he is not the only person of God's people present in that story. But he is the only one that remembers God. In that battle behind him, there is an army shaking in their boots. There is a king who's also kind of a giant. That's one of the things we miss. Saul stood head and shoulders above the rest of the Israelite people. I am short, right? 5'5". I might be average, but if I'm 5'5", someone who is standing head and shoulders above me is what? 6'5"? 7 feet, right? I mean, that's kind of a giant, right? When David tried to put on Saul's armor, it was so clunky on him, he was just like, I can't fight in this. This stuff doesn't fit. And so the almost giant who'd been anointed by Samuel to represent God and to be God's people, he was afraid to fight another giant, right? And yet David could see the giant, but more than the giant, David saw God. And as David declares to Saul his reason for trust, he said, hey, with God's help, I beat bears. With God's help, I beat lions. This guy's just a little bit bigger. I can take him down too. I think for us, if we want to be like David, if we want to be like Caleb and Joshua, we need to be a people who are in the practice of remembering and rehearsing all that God has done for us. We need to be a people who remember his promises. We need to be people who thank him for his interventions. And as we cultivate a remembrance through gratitude, as we regularly take stock and tell the wonderful things God has done, Then we'll be better able to look past the giant and the high walls to see the God who's on our side. One of the things that we can learn as apprentices of Jesus is the importance of reflecting and remembering all that God has done for us, so that in those times of challenge, we can continue to fix our eyes on him and trust him. We can take courage from those things that God has done. Now, the third thing I think we can learn from this story is that when God calls us to do something, he also equips us for the journey. When God called these people out of slavery in Egypt, he called them to take the promised land, and both Caleb and Joshua recognized that when God has called us to do something, he's going to give us what we need. Caleb especially was quick to say, hey guys, we can do this. The Lord is with us. The giants and the fortified walls are like helpless prey. They have no protection, and the Lord is with us. Caleb could see what the rest of the Israelites could not. That God had called and equipped the Israelites for the task, even though they were a once enslaved people with no military training. It didn't make sense to the people, but it did make sense to God. And so I want to ask you the question, friends, what has God called you to do? Has he called you to be salt and light for him at your work? Has he called you to give? Has he called you to honor your parents when doing that is difficult? Has he called you to move? Has he called you to stay? Whatever God has called you to do, he can and will equip you. Often he won't give you everything you need because you're designed for community. We often need others to help us fully step into all that God has for us. But when God calls, he equips. When God sends, he goes with. When God instructs us to open our mouths, he gives us the words to speak. But most of the Israelite community forgot that when God calls us to do something, he gives what we need to step into his purposes. One of the other things that I see in this story is I see that so often we struggle with that perseverance, right? Here's the Israelites on the edge. 12 of them are actually wandering through. They experience it. But right when they're about to have that moment of breakthrough, right when they're about to step into what God has for them, at that moment they shrink back. Friends, I think there's something really important in the Christian faith to persevere. When things are hard, to stay faithful, to stay committed, to say, yes, I will. To recognize that God's the one fighting the battle, and even and especially when it's hard, even when we don't know the outcome, to stay faithful and true to what God has called us to do, to persevere and press through. Friends, I don't know what challenges you're facing today. I don't know what giants or fortified cities are in the way. But what we want to do right now, before we move into a prayer time and then a communion time, is what we want to do right now is we just want to respond to this story through song by reminding us that God is the one who's really fighting the battles with us. And so as the band comes, I just invite you to close your eyes for a moment. And I want you to get very honest with yourself. Maybe you don't know what giant is in your way. Maybe you need God to help you see. But if there is something that is in your path, if there is a difficult choice that you feel you are making, but you don't know where God is in the story, if there is a giant or a fortified city that's in your way, I just want you to recognize that, to name it even, and to say, hey, God, I don't know what this is. I don't know how to fight this. I don't know what to do. And then as the band comes, they're going to sing a song that reminds us that God is on our side, that he's the one fighting the battle. And I'd encourage you just to surrender that situation to him, to surrender that story to him, to surrender that moment to him, and then to invite him to make war in that situation on your behalf. Because God is the one who fights the battles for us.